devote to meeting up with people and ministry-wise.
Brilliant. So that gives us a little bit of a kind of introduction as to us and to kind of how we've got into the topic, and particularly some kind of caveats before we kind of dive into the question at hand. So as Sal says, we've homeschooled in the past. We've more recently sent our kids to independent schools, though it's quite interesting. We've never publicly said that's what we're doing in a kind of formal, this is what you need to do way, because we're aware that the whole issue of education is something that, just like lots of things in church life, we can divide over. And even here in Highfields Church, we have people whose kids are in mainstream state schools, Church of Wales, kind of little C Christian schools, independent schools that aren't Christian, independent schools that are Christian, boarding school, and homeschool. And we have parents who do all those things, and we actually have teachers in virtually all of those contexts teaching in our church. And so this is one of those areas where it's very easy to kind of feel judged or judge each other. And so we're really careful not to do that. I think it's only once that I shared several years ago. I was teaching a session on transgender in the church, and someone asked a question about education, and I think for the first and only time disclosed, some of you know, we actually homeschool our kids, and this is kind of part of the picture there, but I'm very cautious not to kind of make this a kind of real Christians do this or that or the other, because it's so easy for us to kind of go down that route in terms of kind of legalism, I suppose, quote unquote. But we do have convictions about it, and so we just wanted to kind of flag that up at the start. I guess we'd want to say that we all need to be thinking about our educational choices, and the fact is no one educational system guarantees the spiritual health or the salvation of our children. We just need to recognize that salvation is of the Lord. We read, don't we, in Jonah 2. And so the fact is, we've all got different circumstances, different situations, different areas of financial ability, different support networks around us, different catchment areas that we live in, different educational needs that our kids have. And part of being good parents has to be knowing, as well as where we want to take our kids, the kids that they are in the first place. And our kids are very different from each other, and some might thrive in one environment different from another. And also, I guess we'd say that we've got different kind of missional context/callings where we just need to kind of admit that we're different people when we're not to kind of import our model on someone else. But having said that, we do think that the Bible does speak into the question of education. I'm going to read out some words from Psalm 78, which are so seminal in thinking about education generally. This is Psalm 78, verses 1-3, or 1-4. My people, hear my teaching, listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from of old. Things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. And that's a good kind of reminder of the fact that God has, and what we're going to do is we're going to give you five biblical principles, a little kind of excursus when we think a bit about church history, and then 5 applications of those principles. That's the kind of the shape of the next 20 minutes or so. And then there's 25 minutes of Q&A. So that's the plan. So 5 biblical principles. First one is that education is the responsibility of a child's parents. Now, that's the kind of first point to make. Now, that doesn't mean that parents need to educate their kids, and it may well be that the best thing or the right thing for them to do, given their circumstances, is to delegate that to someone else. But they are still ultimately accountable for the raising of their children in the fear and knowledge of the Lord. That is a clear biblical instruction taught in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. Nowhere, for example, in the scriptures are we told that the responsibility of education is to be necessarily delegated to, say, the state as the people who really have the best interest of our children and our families at heart. And so the kind of named person scheme in Scotland that was being proposed a few years ago, the idea that the state will monitor exactly what's going on in a child's life, that doesn't find biblical warrant at all. It's parents who are responsible for the raising and the training of their children in the Lord. And so Psalm 78 says that we're responsible for telling the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. And places like Judges 2 verses 10-12 explain that where Israel failed to do that, things began to unravel very, very quickly. And the fact is that first point, that education fundamentally is a responsibility of a child's parents, that praise God, is currently enshrined in the UK law. So the state recognises that. So parents are still free to educate their kids how they feel best, whether that's via state schools or church schools or independent schools or homeschools. Interestingly, over the last couple of years, homeschooling has just kind of shot up, as I'm sure we were aware of over the pandemic, when we all had to do it for a while. And many thought, why on earth haven't we considered this more seriously before now? Now, the fact is that even here in Wales, there's greater constraint coming down on parents. So things like the right to withdraw your kids from RSC, sex education, has been taken away. But fundamentally, education is the prerogative of parents. At least the responsibility lies with parents. They can delegate it, and that's the first biblical principle. Over to you, Sam.
Yeah, I think a second key principle would be that education, which is the responsibility of parents, is not just the imparting of information and knowledge and skills in order to get grades and do a job. It is the formation of a whole person. And biblically, we think of that person as body, mind, heart and soul. So we would think about a person Christianly, perhaps in a different way to how a secular state would think about a person, as having a soul that is made for relationship with God. And that really needs to be in our thinking when we're talking about education. And so when we look at passages like Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 to 9, I'm sure we're quite familiar with. I'll just read that out for us. It says, these commandments I give to you today are to be on our hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. It doesn't think about our teaching as something that happens between the hours of 9 and 3 in one particular context. It's really a whole life formation. And I think it's true that children are often impacted as much by the atmosphere around them, the habits that they form, the culture they're immersed in, the examples of peers and teachers, the values of a place, almost as much, if not more, than the information that is imparted to them. And we need to be conscious of that. So again, whatever context we might choose to educate our children, we need to be aware of the impact that atmosphere and people and habits and values around them are having on their conscience, on how they use their will, on their loves and their desires, and on their character and their relationship with God. Again, Ephesians 6:4, fathers are encouraged not to exasperate their children, but to bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. I think the Greek word there is paideia, which is that idea of nurture and discipline, discipleship. And again, it's very much a whole life principle. Great.
Okay, so principle 1, education and responsibility of parents. Principle 2, education is for the whole person, not just a small part like brains that need to be filled up. Principle 3 is, and this is a kind of a wider biblical principle that applies not just to education, but to the whole of life. But that is to say that the Westminster Confession of Faith got it right. The chief end of man, the purpose of existence, is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever, which means, can cash that down into all the subsections, the chief end of education. Surely, if the chief end of humanity is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, then the chief end of education should be to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Just this last Sunday, a couple of days ago, I was preaching on 1 Corinthians 10 and 11. Famously, 1 Corinthians 11, verse or 10:31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And so again, the educational choices that we make, we need to recognize that the reason that we've been placed on this earth has been to glorify God and to enjoy him, and in so doing enjoy him, if Piper is right in the connection between those 2 points. And I think he is, and therefore how we educate will speak into that. We don't want to kind of at this stage legislate it has to be this way, but we've got to have that in mind. Is this helping our child glorify God and enjoy him? That's the third principle.
To just flush out in terms of subject.
Oh, that's coming down. That's okay.
Fourthly, then, is just this biblical idea of wisdom. So we might think in education a lot about knowledge and skills that are being acquired, but really our goal biblically is to go beyond pure information to wisdom. And we're told in Proverbs 9 verse 10, and really throughout the whole book of Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so we need to recognize that God must have his place, his proper place in the education of the child, and that they will not become wise, however much they know, however many skills they acquire, they will not become wise if they do not have God in the right place in their hearts and their minds. Indeed, the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. And I think probably much of our secular state would say in its heart that there is no God. And how much is God being put in his rightful place in the educational settings that we might choose? Also, 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1 talks about knowledge puffing up, but good character and love building up. And so this stresses again the importance of character and virtue formation alongside the acquisition of knowledge. I think children need to understand their place in the world in relation to God and to nature in order to live wisely.
Great. So that's principle 4. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom from Proverbs. And then I guess the fifth biblical principle we wanted to fire out was that we want to kind of say no at every opportunity to the sacred secular divide, which I guess if we're not thinking about kind of the education of children, if we're in good evangelical churches, we are aware of the sacred secular divide and we try to kind of dispel it. But the fact is that as Abraham Kuyper taught us 100 plus years ago, there is no square inch of this world over which Christ, who is sovereign, did not say, "This is mine." And that means that Christ is Lord over everything in our worlds, including the education that we allow ourselves and we put our children in. So he is Lord of maths. He is Lord of history. He is Lord of geography. Whether we acknowledge him or not is another question, but he is Lord of those subjects. So the reason maths works is because he is a God of order, and he has established laws in his world that obey kind of the regularity principles that we are so used to. The reason history unfolds as it does is because of his sovereign overruling intervention in nations, in individuals, etc., etc. The reason creative arts are so beautiful and so enriching is because he has made human beings in his image to reflect and represent him as creative beings under his authority. And so I suppose the question at that point is, how much is that lordship of Jesus acknowledged and honoured in our child's education between 9 and 3? He's not a side note. He's Lord of it all. And there are loads of biblical scriptures that could kind of speak into that, that would say, yes, we want our kids to be able to get a job, but and pass their exams, but there's much more to life than getting a job and passing exams. The fact is, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. We need to recognize from Psalm 24, as I've referred to before, 1 Corinthians 10:31, do all eating, drinking, everything to the glory of God. We might think about Colossians 1:15 and 16, which describe Jesus as being the head over all things, and in him all things hold together. The reason that the ink stays on the page is because the Lord Jesus holds it on the page. The reason my molecules in my body hold together is because he holds them together. You might turn to places like 2 Corinthians 10:25 that talk about taking every thought captive, and we don't kind of wage as the world wages, but we recognize that that Christ is Lord over the kind of the thought life of a human being, and we fight on those levels, at the level of the kind of worldview level, not at the level of the kind of physical level. And most famously of all, perhaps Romans 12 verses 1 and 2, which talks about true worship being and not being conformed to the pattern of this world, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind. So we acknowledge God, and praise him, yes, in Sunday and church activities, but is that the only place we do? Or in a 5-minute kind of bedtime story before we go to sleep at night? He is Lord of everywhere. Do we acknowledge him as such? So that's 5 very quick biblical principles to remind you what they were. Education is the responsibility of parents. Education is a holistic thing. The whole being is being formed, not just the mind. And the goal of education, like all of life, should be the glory of God and enjoyment of him. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, according to the scriptures, and we should shun sacred secular divide.
I think before we go on to applications, just a little aside on church history. I'm no expert on this subject, but I went to a few classes when Dave was at Bible college, and I was just really struck by the fact that our current model of predominantly state education is not really in keeping with a lot of church history, and particularly at times of spiritual and cultural reformation. The church and Christian families have been at the forefront of education, both nurturing the children of Christians in a very intentional way, but also reaching out magnanimously and offering a different form of education to welcome others into. So we think of the Reformation, we think of Victorian times and Charles Spurgeon and such like, the Sunday school movement, but also setting up other schools to reach out into communities. And so that's been something that's helped me in my thinking, although there may be a standard mainstream model currently, that may not have been the model throughout church history. And so to have a look and a healthy respect for history as well in our thinking is a good thing.
So we've had five biblical principles, little sidebar on church history. Now we're going to go to 5 quick fire applications, and then we'll stop in about 6 or 7 minutes, and it's over to you for questions. So let's go on to some applications.
So really they flow on from the biblical principles that we've laid out. Firstly, if Christian parents are responsible for what their children are being taught, then it falls to us to know what they are being taught and how. And so this is more straightforward in some contexts than others, but we need to be intentional and creative in making sure that we know what our children's minds are being fed, the values that are being imparted at each age, and also the culture and the influence of peers that they're going to be immersed in all day long. And so that's going to look different in different contexts as to how parents make sure that they know what's going in and on around their children. So
principle 1, know what's going in. Principle 2, more specifically focusing on truth and Christian truth. Parents need to be and are responsible for ensuring that truth is going into their kids, and gospel truth, and Christ is given his rightful place. And so there will be places where in the schooling that our children are exposed to, perhaps where honestly untruths are going in. And now we can all think of the specific places, and it's interesting that this is a discussion we're having now, and I'm not surprised by that, given where our culture is at and the kind of rising confusion on issues like gender and sexuality that are coming up. But this applies in lots of different places. But to get in the habit of talking with kids about what they're learning at school, and not just kind of assume naively, or of course that's a different domain, I'm no expert in that. Well, no, you get up to speed with the issues that they're talking about, and particularly be talking through what they're learning to ensure that it's truth that is setting the agenda in their thinking, and particularly truth about Christ. I think flowing into that is that in order to have that atmosphere in the home where children are going to tell you things that they've been taught or exposed to, which they know you will disagree with or disapprove of, you've got to work hard to create that culture of safety and trust and acceptance, where they are going to let you know those things and engage in discussion of them in ways that aren't embarrassing or awkward, or where they're going to get a lecture or an earful from you. So this is the kind of third principle, which is relationship. Is that one, isn't it? Really, which is that kind of principle that if we're going to foster really close, speaking into maybe challenging ways into the kids, you've got to have a good relationship with your kids where there is that sense of trust and love, and a kind of people aren't awkward and covering stuff up, because at the moment that's the case, then you're on the back foot, and there's a kind of secret area of learning which they're ashamed of, say, or friendship groups, and you over here, and then you can end up just kind of your two worlds, those two boats just float further and further apart, which is just
and that's going to take time and inconvenience sometimes for us. Late night conversations, when you think you're just about to down tools and then something comes up, and you can't afford to waste that opportunity. And when it comes, saying awkward things, taking the initiative to say that thing first before your child has to. Having their friends round, so you know them, they know you. Your home is a place where they're welcome, and people can make mess and feel comfortable, and you're willing to put yourself out. You're willing to spend time watching movies that you are happy to watch with your children, so the stuff that's going into them. You have talking points with them, and just being willing to put ourselves out for them.
Great. So fourth principle, which is a kind of application really of what we said before in terms of living for God's glory rather than the values of our world. A child's education is not just, or even maybe primarily measured in grades and the kind of metrics of our culture that say, unless you get your A star or your 9s and you achieve highly, then you're not a valuable person. Unless you're in the make the sports team or get the high grades in music, you're not a valuable person. And they will be surrounded by this kind of meritocratic approach that you're really valuable if you get this in some contexts. Some contexts, grades are just an irrelevance, and it's just all about having a laugh. And you obviously want them to do as best as they can because they're doing it for God's glory. But ensuring that they're not kind of living their lives in comparison with peers who are just simply chasing the grades or kind of demanding parents who are trying to do that. So we want to help them to position that. We don't want to say it's an irrelevance, but it's not the only thing, and maybe not even the best thing, because we're looking for whole character formation and the development of the whole being, not just that little part of their body. They're not brains on sticks that need to be their whole beings. I think that comes in what we communicate to them, what we're interested in, rather than how did you do on this test. Well, not only that, but the questions we ask when they come out of school are often on the way home. So, tell me something kind that somebody did, for each of the children. What was an act of kindness that was shown in your class today, or tell me a way that you were inspired to praise God more. So they will pick up our values from the things that we show interest in and ask questions about. Okay, so that's the fourth principle, fourth application. It's not just about grades. And then fifthly, flowing on from that, obliterating that sacred secular divide. Again, it's about conversations. So joining those dots in conversations over tea. What we're learning today. Oh, what does that tell us about God? How can you use the gifts that God has given you to do this particular homework assignment? So you're constantly connecting those two worlds that can be easily pushed apart. Or what did we learn on Sunday in Sunday school that's going to impact how you respond to your friend in a situation? So just constantly linking those two worlds together. So there we are, 5 biblical principles, a little sidebar on bit of church history, and then 5 applications of those principles. We have deliberately left lots of stuff unsaid and are therefore ready to take any questions you want to throw at us. So there we go, that's our time.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Dave and Sal, and everyone else. That's now over to you. So please feel free just to unmute and or pipe up with a question, or to put it in the chat if you'd prefer. If there's a long awkward silence, I will as ever jump in with one of my questions, which I'm always happy to do, but please feel free.
Can I say thanks to you, Dave and Sal, for a very clear presentation, and I would just like to, for those who would be interested in home education, recommend the Christian Home Education Support Service. which has been going now for about 40 years, which is about when we started home education. That can be helpful to people who are concerned about the practicalities. So if anybody would like more information on that, it is online.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Tom, can I just chip in and ask a question? How do you guys go about talking about this within the church family and having a sort of discussion about an issue which you consider is important, but perhaps is a minefield? How do you kind of create that culture? Because it seems to me that there could be families within our churches who are persuadable to think critically about this, but we don't want to do it if it comes at the cost of division.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good question. Well, as I said at the very top, my general kind of abiding principles are, parents are responsible for the education of their kids. That's totally clear, the top of the line. Therefore you need to think about what you're doing educationally. Don't just go to float along with the mainstream. Just because everyone else is doing whatever doesn't mean you should do that too. But then thirdly, and absolutely clear, don't judge people who are making different educational decisions from where you're at. Because this isn't a kind of primary matters of first importance gospel issue, though it's not an irrelevant issue. So it kind of fits in that bracket between somewhere, but it's not trivial, but it's not the top of the list things. So I haven't ever, as I said, said this is what you need to do. Those principles will come out, that we don't judge, we Jesus is Lord of everything, and we're responsible for the education of our parents. They will come out in preaching, but generally it's much more been our practice to be kind of reactive, so people see what we're doing when they find out about it and follow up that way, rather than us proactively saying this is what you should do. That's a beginning of an answer, but you may want to speak.
I do feel sometimes almost like we've fallen off the horse the side of not speaking into it enough, because we fear of judgment, and the principles that we have just laid out, hopefully they may have come through just by general exposition over the years, but part of me would love to present that to more of my friends, but yeah, I guess we came to Cardiff 8 years ago and we started homeschooling at that point, and that was statement enough, really, without talking about it. And so, if people ask, we have our answers, and we've tried to do life alongside people so they can get a feel of what it's like, and just drip feed little things in.
The doing life alongside, I think, is very important, because you can teach it and say you should do this, but this is called as much as it is taught. So I think so when we arrived at Highfields, there were homeschool families already here who are phenomenal people and just were such a well respected. One of the elders in their did homeschool their kids, and so I'm not sure maybe I wouldn't have had the courage to do it myself, but there'd been a kind of trailblazers already there, and you can disagree. And what was so lovely is that we've got really, really good friends within the church family who are in different places on this one. Really, really good friends, and we kind of pray for each other and support each other. They know the convictions that we've got, and I think increasingly it's what's interesting is that more and more people, particularly the older folks, are saying we never homeschooled, we never did Christian education when we were at that place, but seeing where things are at these days, there's no way we wouldn't go that route, and we're finding that more and more. So I'm not surprised this conversation is happening. Whether we get to the stage where we say actually we want to present this as a thing, I'm still not yet persuaded that is the way to go. It's similar a little bit to a few years ago. They banned smacking in Wales in the last month, and Sally did quite a lot of speaking about that beforehand. And we take what we think is a kind of the Christian free position on that issue. But to say you should all do this, you've got to be careful about overplaying that. So there is a subtlety there. And my last comment is that I have been in churches where the educational decisions that people have been made has become a primary issue in that community, and it's become quite divisive, and it's kind of not quite split the church, but there has been a bit of a sense of, you're really, the real Christians do this, and the kind of slightly not so good Christians do that. And so we were very cautious to kind of establish that kind of mentality. But there's no denying that we're doing what we're doing. We haven't promoted it hugely, but people observe us, I think. Have you got any thoughts about that, Ian? It sounds like you've thought about it yourself.
No, I think, we speak into most of the other kind of big topics in life. I just wondered, I mean, have you gone as far as like, what does this look like? Have you ever done kind of an evening just on parents talking about education, at the level of principles?
That question, no. We have done a few things. So we've been talking for the last several years about seeing Christian schools get going here, and so some people have popped in on that. We have done some parenting young parents classes. In a sense, what I'm observing is that some of the when you teach lots of this, like you in a sense teaching the lordship of Christ over every area of your life, and no sacred secular divide. And UCCF have been doing this for years. Your subject matters for God, and you need to not just kind of leave piety and Bible to Sundays, but Christ is Lord of everything. Once students get that, and the penny really drops that Jesus is Lord of my art subject, my law, my history, or my science, whatever, it's not rocket science to say, well, wait a second, like that's true when you're at uni, but why isn't that true when you're 5? And so I am actually observing some of our young, recently married couples with really little kids who've been exposed to some of that UCCF input, much more open to this discussion than other folks who've been in the kind of more mainstream way for a while. But
I think another way, and you'd have to have a very sort of secure, trusting church community, which takes years to build. You have a context where you invite people who are doing things differently to present, but different from thought. They're thought through. They're working from biblical convictions to present, platform different ways of doing it, and then have time for Q&A. So you're not just promoting one outworking, but you're allowing people to hear all the principles and engage with them, but whilst respecting the diversity of practice.
And I think that's not a bad call. I've thought about doing that before now, and maybe that's something that we're probably getting to the time where we might do.
Thank you.
Could I just say something to Ian there? The fact that we have home educated whilst being members of various different churches, and the attitude of the pastor is absolutely crucial. If the pastor himself is open and fosters that spirit of openness, basically what Dave was saying, then that works well, and people with various convictions can work alongside one another. But that the pastor is the key.
Thanks.
Hi there. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. Can I just ask, so my children are kind of primary school at the moment, and we're very thankful we've got a lovely primary school Christian headmaster. But thinking about secondary school, and you were talking about sometimes there are influences and things said that are actually kind of lies. I was just wondering if there are any principles that you can mention, thinking about at what point do you let those lies, or those lies become so much that you think, actually, this really, my child shouldn't be in this context anymore? It's probably a tricky one.
I would want my children to know that they're lies and be able to discern that they're lies at whatever stage they're hearing them. And so obviously every child's different. You know, your child, at what point you feel the foundations are sufficiently laid that they can discern. I mean, our goal is that we send them out and they're going to be exposed to anything and everything, but that there's a wisdom call, developmental call, as to at what point you expose them to the different lies that are out there, and whether they're capable of, at each stage, of withstanding them, of recognizing them, of discerning them. And so, you know, that's a personal thing. It depends on you and your child. It depends on the particular school, what you know is being enculturated or said there. So personally, you know, in terms of areas of sexuality, I have felt it's not appropriate developmentally to be talking in categories of sexual attraction and things like that before a developmental stage where that is part of a child's experience. And so I would prevent them from, as much as possible, from encountering those ideas until they're developmentally ready to do so. And I can talk in those categories without introducing things prematurely. And yeah, sorry, I don't know if that was that.
I was going to say a couple of things that would be, you know, I don't know what you do in terms of things like movies, for example. Like that's an obvious thing that you're all maybe watching a film together on a Saturday afternoon, and you know every Disney movie, say, will depart from a biblical worldview at a place. And so if you're not used to helping your child think engagingly about distinguishing truth and error, and distortion and twisting and exaggeration, whatever, then taking a film and saying, hey, what was whatever it is, Encanto, or you name it. So there's a film we saw last year which was called Luca, and it was like, man, there were so many things that were just like clearly trying to make it feel like that it was just a distortion.
It was lies told very beautifully.
Beautiful lies. But and the conversation we had on the back of it, I don't think it necessarily even redeemed itself, but it was like, we're having a conversation at this point, and just because something is beautifully told doesn't make it true. So that's my one point, is that sometimes getting a culture of talking about things like that will be really good to help you kind of do it. Secondly, is that my goodness me, 9 to 5 is a lot of hours every day. 9 to 3, times 5 times 40 weeks is just hours upon hours upon hours of just air that's being breathed. And there might be times where a particular lie is raised in an instance, but the culture and the environment of that space, I think just helping people realize that that's very hard to kind of, it's hard to just say, well, that little one bit was inappropriate, but everything else is fair game. The influence of peers, the kind of conversations that take place around that, as well as the content of the curriculum, are both things that you're going to want to kind of press in on. I think
analogy that somebody gave me, which I found really helpful, is the kind of gardening analogy in a greenhouse, that when we put seedlings out, we don't just put them out straight in a frost. You keep them in a propagator or in a greenhouse in conditions that will help them thrive and become strong initially, and then you put them out in the day when it's warm, and then you bring them back in at night, and you gradually harden them up until they're strong enough to endure the harsh conditions, and then you leave them out in the garden. And I found that quite a helpful analogy of preparation, that there are things that they're not ready to endure until those values have been instilled, and until you have told them the categories that they can recognize the lies with, and such like. And I want to be the one who introduces the lie, if you know what I mean, first, as in I want to walk them through it before they go and encounter it. I don't want their friend to be the first person who tells them that lie, but I want them to hear it in the end, but them to know, if that helps.
Because often it's the lies are told before they're really ready for the lie, so you wouldn't want to
absolutely
know that. Okay, thank you.
I have, if you haven't got the question, there is a glaring question which no one's yet asked, which is the kind of evangelistic question, which I think if it's not been asked, that I'm happy to answer it, or at least speak into it, because it may be people watching on the Zoom call after the event, and we've only got 5 minutes left. But the big question, is like, surely you're keeping, if you're not in the school, then how do you share your faith with children, like, etc., which is an important question. And we are passionate about evangelism at Highfields and in our home, and so forth. And Salah has begun to answer that question in terms of the preparation before kind of integration, or preparation before mission. I think is one thing. We don't send our 5-year-olds to be missionaries in Nigeria. We train in the same way. You don't send someone to be a missionary out of nowhere. You train them before sending them on, and that's really what we're talking about in terms of this form. The other area that I would simply say is that it's not simply the school gate that is the place where all personal evangelism happens, or in the classroom. We've even though we've not had the school gate experience for us, we've had with unbelieving neighbours in our house repeatedly. We've had the kids are in sports clubs or after school clubs, or we've had colleagues that we work with. In the first few years of homeschooling, we were had loads of contact with unbelieving neighbours, whether they were kind of Muslim parent and toddler groups coming through, or we had a light party at our house and had 30 neighbours who all came over for it. And I just think it's a mistake to think that the only place of frontline mission is in the context of being in a school, a mainstream school.
Also our primary area of evangelism is our own children, and so there's a risk of jeopardizing that primary calling in order to reach others, and kind of using our children as a means to get in contact with others. Actually having our kids come along with us and seeing us evangelize our peers, pray with them, share the gospel with a neighbor, can be a really powerful thing.
Also, I'd throw in, we're not saying at all, we've tried to be fairly open-handed about the choices people make, but Christian teachers who are in mainstream schools, I'm not saying they all need to leave. We pray for our Christian teachers, and what an opportunity you've got while you've got it. Ditto assemblies, CU meetings, after school clubs. We're totally pro all of that kind of stuff, for the sake of the unbelievers who are in there. But is that the best place for our children to be, or the only place? Our time is almost done, I think. So I wanted to just throw that question in, because someone watching the Zoom might think, come on, that's the obvious question, no one asked it, so I asked it.
I think there's the long-term view of, will our witness over the generations be more impacted by sticking in there and hanging on by the skin of our teeth,
education,
surviving amongst all these lies and trying to grab a few people for a youth group here and there, or by the longer term raising of a generation who are solidly prepared to engage with their culture in the next one.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much again, Dave and Sal. I wonder if just the last couple of minutes, whether there are any particular resources you can mention. I mean, I know I just recalled that back at the start of the first lockdown, Gary Williams did a post on the Pastor Academy blog where he had a list of questions to kind of talking with your kids about maths and literature and science and stuff. I found that really helpful. Just anything like that, or in general kind of resources for how thinking this through.
I think there are books and things for us as adults to understand the culture we're in. So since I've started teaching 2 days a week, I've got much more time. I listen to books on Audible when I'm cleaning. So the Carl Trueman book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. I listened to Nancy Pearcey's Love Thy Body. Just really helpful to understand, wow, how did we get to where we are, and how can we engage compassionately and that sort of thing ourselves. I don't know if you're asking for like educational resources.
Anything and everything.
Thinking this through resources. I suppose there's a the provocative American author Douglas Wilson wrote a quite provocative but short, punchy little book called Why Christian Kids Need a Christian Education, which is about 80 pages long, which is worth a read. I don't agree with everything he writes ever, but I always find it stimulating, and he asks really good questions. So I think I'd stick that in the mix.
And the whole Christian classical education movement.
Yeah.
Good to think through that kind of formation of the whole person, taking every thought captive.
There was another book which is very seminal, which we read years ago, but had a big impact about, I think it was about 30 or 40 years ago, by Francis Schaeffer's daughter. Susan Macaulay Schaeffer wrote a book called For the Children's Sake, which was really a bit of a kind of introduced the concept of home education in a big way. Like it was being done in the States in certain places, but that when that came out, I think that's quite a seminal book. And she herself is kind of exposing people to a 19th century educationist called Charlotte Mason, who thought a lot about the formation of the child, and wrote some really helpful books. But For the Children's Sake book is quite a good kind of intro to that world as well.
Brilliant. Thank you again so